Good morning. It's so good that we have so many participants to this trade policy conference. My name is Katharina Tröger. I'm the chairperson of the parliamentary group, the Greens, and I also welcome you on behalf of Reinhard Bütikofer. It's important for us that trade policy is a European issue, so we need the colleagues from the European Parliament, and we are very pleased to be here in the European House and to have Mrs. Wyatt here to discuss about trade policy. And the title is Better the World Through Trade. Thinking of the discussion during the last two legislative period, you would not have expected perhaps the Greens to choose such a title. I said our position was always misunderstood, though many didn't believe us, but now reality confirms us in these questions. We in the traffic light coalition agreed on an agenda that puts this in the center. How can we better the world while deepening trade relationships? And I'm very pleased that we discuss it and align it with what is happening at the European level. The proposal of the European Commission making sustainable chapters the focus, that we align trade and sustainability interests. This is what we pushed in the Green Party, and this has now become the mainstream here in Berlin. The time has come, and this is very clear when we look at international developments. There is a new Brazilian government that puts climate protection and protection of the rainforest in the center, not unlike Bolsonaro did it. So it's important that we, Berlin and Brussels, discuss how can we use this time window with the Brazilian government to arrive at a Mercosur agreement that puts fair trade relation in the center, but also the protection of the Amazon, because this is a task for the world community to avoid that we exceed a tipping point, so that we work together with Brazil. So it's not that the EU declares the partners what the world should look like. At the other hand, 1 year ago, we saw very clearly that there is one valid principle. Economic policy and foreign policy cannot be separated. We saw this in a very brutal way when Putin started the aggression in Ukraine. It was also an economic war, and the dependence of Germany on fossil fuels from Russia has cost a very high price in Germany. So one of the most important lessons of the last year is that critical dependencies on regimes that do not share our values need to be in our focus. How can we achieve strategic sovereignty? This doesn't mean decoupling. In China, it cannot be decoupling, but we have to look where are risks, dependencies that make us vulnerable in the EU in case of escalating conflicts. We are just starting to discuss these issues, and we need to discuss it also with economic actors. And I am looking forward to do exactly this. I'm looking forward to a very insightful event. And now let me hand over the floor to Reinhard Bütikofer. Very good to have you all here. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And I do not only wish it to you here in this hall, but also everybody who has joined us online, because this will be streamed in German and in English. Let me welcome you, Mrs. Weyand. I know it has been your secret wish to participate in a trade event of the Green Party. This is why Anna Cavazzini, Mrs. Ströge and myself organized this event to fulfill this wish. Thank you very much that you are here today. I also want to welcome Franziska Brandner, who will give the second keynote, Michael Kellner, and all the other lecturers and the guests. There is a second reason to hold this event. We think we need new and deeper discussion about trade policy. The environment is changing, so trade policy must change. The WTO is no longer uncontested. The EU was forced during the last 6 years to use trade defense instruments to respond where trade multilateralism didn't protect us enough. The EU also pushed ahead bilateral trade agreements when multilateral hopes were blocked. The pandemic showed us what unilateral dependencies mean, what it means if supply chains cannot be relied on. Katharina, you mentioned authoritarian regimes. This was a bitter lesson we had to draw from the aggression of Russia against Ukraine. You must not be dependent on authoritarian regimes, because they may use it as a weapon at a very high price for us. Not to be dependent and not decouple are two different things, but I would like not to use decoupling, but rather de-risking, as the president of the European Commission put it. We also face new challenges as a result of digital trade. Trade is to make the future greener. Fortunately, we, the Greens, are not the only ones who preach it. The Commission took it up but also the US representatives, yes, as Mrs. Yellen, talked quite a lot about greening trade, and human rights also must play a role, looking at the bitter reality of forced labor, especially state-ordered forced labor. The weights are shifting internationally, and geopolitics is gaining in importance for trade policy. And we want to respond to this, but also shaping it. The role for the green has shifted a bit because we participate in governments in Germany and beyond, and this makes it possible also to shape trade policies rather than just commenting it. For instance, when the Chancellor, after his visit in India, said he now wants to work to give more drive to the EU-Indian trade agreement. I would like to add, but then you have to think whether the 2007 mandate of deep and comprehensive can be maintained. The last 16 years have changed things, and those who want to have this agreement with India, which is important, also needs to discuss it. Perhaps we can also include this in today's discussion. I'm looking forward to this discussion. I hope it will be insightful. And now we go to the first keynote. Mrs. Wyant, you've got the floor.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, members of parliament. I'm very much happy to be here, and I wanted to speak on the keyword change of an era. The fact that this conference is taking place here together with the parliamentary group of the Bundestag and the European Parliament, and the fact that you invited me as a representative of the federal government is also a sign of a change of an era. But I would like to focus on the aspect of trade policy, because it does not only relate to defense policy, but all different fields. It encompasses all policy areas. This turning point in trade policy is not primarily due to Putin's brutal war of aggression against Ukraine. Rather, it can be attributed to long-term factors, the geopolitical tensions between the US and China, whose state capitalist economic system poses increasing challenges to the international order, the tendency towards fragmentation and globalization. When Bütikofer mentioned this, and this first manifested itself in supply chain disruption. But today, this has reached a whole new dimension in the face of systemic competition between liberal democracies and autocratic regimes. The increasing undermining of the rule-based order, the law of the strongest, is increasingly taking the place of the strength of the law and of the conflicting effects of globalization and technological development on the economy and society. On the one hand, the international division of labor has led to huge increases in wealth, lifting millions out of poverty. On the other hand, it has caused growing inequalities, leaving some populations and communities by the wayside. And last but not least, the urgency of climate protection and the need to align all policies with the Green Deal. The EU responded to these upheavals with a new trade policy strategy 2021, with its triad of openness, sustainability and assertiveness. It aims to enable Europe to actively shape the transformation of globalization in accordance with our values and interests. Europe's much vaunted strategic autonomy must be an open one based on partnership with others. We will not master the challenges ahead by closing ourselves off, but only in cooperation with others. Towards open strategic autonomy means as much multilateralism as possible, as much autonomous action as necessary. The operational implementation of the new strategy has largely focused on the pillars of assertiveness. And I use the English term also in German, assertiveness, because it really expresses well what we intend to do. And sustainability, because economic openness can only be politically communicated if it is clear that the EU can defend itself against the abuse of its openness and if it aligns trade policy in sustainable ways. And so we have launched a whole range of instruments in recent years. In terms of assertiveness, we've expanded our toolbox on the one hand in the field of fair competition. We were forced to this because in the WTO we needed to find a tool for situations where we were unable to find an arbitration means. So that's speaking about the enforcement regulation. Then after 10 years, we also introduced the International Procurement Instrument. This was a very lengthy legislation process in the EU. And also we dealt with the foreign subsidies regulation to do something against distortions in the market. But also we worked in the field of security, technology and trade through the screening of foreign direct investments. This is still only at the beginning at the EU level. We still have the different national systems with different levels of development, and we will soon have a proposal to be able to also better represent the EU dimension. And the field of export control is also becoming more and more important. Europeanization is also only at the start, and we will work on this in the future. And the tool that by Reinhard Bütikofer knows very well, the anti-coercion instrument, we hope that we will be able to create a tool to the end of this month that will help us to defend ourselves against pressure from other states on sustainability. We have acted both autonomously. I'm speaking about the CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the Deforestation Act, Supply Chain Act, Forced Labor Act, and some of these have already been approved, and others will still have to be adopted. And also in the WTO framework, we also started initiatives with the Trade Minister for Climate Action. It's an initiative by Commissioner Dombrovskis. We also work on the Plastics Initiative, and also we have a very ambitious agreement on fighting against fisheries subsidies. It's a very ambitious phase, more ambitious than what has ever been agreed at a multilateral level. Most importantly, we have comprehensively revised our approach to sustainability. sustainability in bilateral trade agreements. That includes not only stronger focus on the implementation of social and environmental rules agreed in trade agreements through stronger engagement, clearer prioritization, wider involvement of civil society, but also the possibility to suspend trade preferences as a last resort. The New Zealand agreement that we presented to the Council and the European Parliament for conclusion last week reflects this new approach. But the adjustment of trade policy must go further. Trade policy today is an integral part of economic statecraft. The coherent use of all economic policy instruments for geopolitical and geoeconomic goals. Trade policy as a fully Europeanist policy area is one of the most powerful instruments of a geopolitically oriented EU. In terms of economic statecraft, we need a comprehensive strategy that achieves the best possible outcome in the triangle of effectiveness, sustainability, and geopolitics. Let me illustrate the connection between open markets, green transformation, and international self-assertion with a few examples. With all our efforts, only 15% of the critical raw materials we need for the ecological and digital transformation will come from the EU itself. The rest will have to be imported. The ecological transformation, therefore, needs open markets and access to precursors and raw materials. Currently, we're depending mostly on China, and the mistake that we made with Russia, with our dependency, we would not like to repeat this in other fields with other countries. And that does not mean, and I refer to what Reinhard Bütikofer just said, it's not about decoupling. We did an analysis which 5 to 6% of trade with China are strategically problematic because they rely on dependencies, but that means that 95% of our trade with China is irrelevant in strategic terms. So that means we can continue to work on this way, but, of course. But if you look at this from the entrepreneurial point of view, of course, then you have still an entrepreneurial risk, and therefore we have to see it that risks have to be borne by the business and not by the whole community. So we have to reduce risks in these terms. The International Energy Agency says that the market for mass-produced green technology will grow threefold by 2030. 80% of this market and much of its growth will be outside, not in the EU, in the US, China, India, and other Asian markets. We need economies of scale for efficient resource-saving production of the products that we need for the green transformation. If we want to make green technologies affordable, not every region in the world can produce only for its own needs. We have an interest in clean tech outside, especially made in Europe, spreading as widely as possible internationally, contributing to climate action. This is what the Green Industrial Plan for More Competition and the Transition to Climate Neutrality presented by the European Commission earlier this month is all about. One of the pillars is open trade for resilient supply chains. Competitiveness and climate neutrality can only be achieved if we have fair competition and open markets. These link the internal market with global growth regions outside the EU, secure and diversify import sources and sales markets for mutual benefit with our partners. Absolutely critical given the decoupling from Russia. And I would actually use this, the term of decoupling in this case. I think it is appropriate when it comes to Russia, but when it comes to China, it's more about reducing dependencies and not decoupling. To this end, we want to expand the existing network of trade agreements both in Latin America and in Asia, as we've concluded negotiations with Chile and are about to do so with Mexico. Mercosur remains. Here, with the change of government in Brazil, there is an opportunity to supplement the already negotiated agreement in the next few months with a credible instrument that sets legally binding requirements for compliance with core labor standards, as well as the implementation of the Paris Agreement, and especially on the issue of deforestation. Does this solve the Amazon problem? Certainly not, but no agreement is no solution either. As we have seen in recent years, we left the region to China to a certain extent. This is not according to our interests, and we need a platform for cooperation, and the chances are very good at the moment. And also with India and Indonesia, we want to make progress and conclude negotiations with Australia by the summer. With Thailand, we have just agreed to resume negotiations. But it is not only about classical trade agreements we need to be completed. These need to be completed by other agreements. For example, we have founded the TTC, Trade and Technology Council with the USA, which deals with issues on the area of tension between trade, security, and technology, and has certainly proven its worth with the Russia sanctions, unfortunately less so with the IRA. But other instruments such as commodity partnerships also make sense, as do agreements to facilitate sustainable investment. Along the lines of the negotiations just concluded with Angola, we need to bring together trade policy measures with development aid, but also financing instruments and concrete projects, for example, in the framework of Global Gateway. This requires a better dovetailing of European and nation-state actions. Of course, our partners do not only want to be suppliers of raw materials, but also to advance their own industrialization and climb up the value chain. That is why we have agreed on the agreement with Chile, for example, that investments can be linked to requirements for local employment and dual pricing for lithium in order to make processing in Chile more worthwhile. In the area of digital trade, we should not leave the setting of international standards to the US and China. The EU, with its rights-based approach, offers an alternative that can be attractive to many countries. That is why we have started negotiations with Japan, and we plan to do so the same with Korea and Singapore. Ladies and gentlemen, we need reliable partners more than ever in the face of today's geopolitical and economic challenges. But reliable does not necessarily mean like-minded. The West against the rest is not a promising recipe, neither politically nor economically or ecologically, socially. The Club of Liberal Democracies is too small to master the challenges of our time alone. The resulting fragmentation would divide us politically, make us all poorer, and the climate neutrality more expensive. For example, the IMF estimates that fragmentation of global technology trade through block formation alone would lead to a 5% reduction in GDP in many countries. A merger of liberal democracies into a gated community would also not be the right strategy for dealing with our political problems. This approach lacks the strategic vision of how global governance should be organized in the future. It is not in our interest to wall ourselves off with high boards, when it is precisely we who would suffer a greater disadvantage from the boards of others. And the boards we build rarely achieve the effect they are thought to achieve. The strategic problem is, how do we organize the coexistence of different systems? And this is where the WTO comes into play. We conduct almost 2/3 of our foreign trade on the basis of WTO rules. Now, we all know that the WTO is in need of reform, but we should therefore not follow the siren sounds that declare the WTO is obsolete. Even in its unreformed form, the WTO acts as a guardrail against protectionism, against beggar the neighbor policies, and as a safeguard against the law of the strongest. The WTO is essential for the stability, predictability, and fairness of international economic relations. WTO rules are also the basis on which we build our bilateral trade agreements and for development. So if we cannot act in this way, we would also have problems in our bilateral trade relations. So we have to address the reform and also have to invest into maintaining the WTO, especially for developing countries and smaller countries in particular. The WTO is essential as a safeguard against abuse of power by the big players, but the WTO also needs to adapt to the challenges of the 21st century. We need to redesign the rules on market distorting subsidies to curb costly and counterproductive subsidy races. We need to strengthen the WTO's role in achieving climate neutrality and design the rules so that all members benefit from them. We will not be able to do this with our 164 members. Therefore, we also need plurilateral approaches within the WTO. If these formats remain open for all members of the WTO, ladies and gentlemen, does the European trade policy designed in this way make the world a better place? So this is the question, actually, that we want to discuss in this conference. And is that even the claim we should have? So if we are serious about the partnership approach, if we meet other countries on an equal footing, if our trade policy is not only for our own benefit, but should also bring positive results for our partners, then we should also humbly acknowledge that Europe does not only have the monopoly of good regulation, and that it is perfectly legitimate for other states, just like the EU, to want to decide their own standards and regulations. What we call the Brussels effect is increasingly being branded as regulatory imperialism in other countries. So they're becoming more and more critical. And I often hear this term regulatory imperialism. You can look at on the internet, the New Year's conference of the Indonesian trade minister in front of a large screen that shows a palm oil plantation and a boot that is stepping on this plantation, and on the sole of that boot is written EU. And this is the perception of many developing countries, many of these countries that we want to initially have partnerships with, but they're located in Asia or in other countries of the world. And so we are criticized loudly and clearly by our partners as green protectionism and extraterritorial regulation. We need to take this criticism seriously and show through our actions that we are indeed about improving sustainability and not about closing off the European market against competitors. And we have to work with the states concerned in implementing our autonomous instruments and support them in meeting the requirements for market access. This is what it will be about in the next few months, and we need this coordination of trade agreements and together with the implementation of autonomous measures, that is important. Trade policy certainly cannot save the world on its own, but economic statecraft geared towards efficiency, resilience, and sustainability can enable the EU to assert itself internationally, to work with others on the basis of our values and interests, and thus to actively shape the next phase of globalization. And I think even if it does not save the world, it would be a very good first step. Thank you very much for your attention.
And now I ask the panelists to come to the fore.
Willkommen bei unserer Diskussion. Oh ja. Willkommen.
Welcome to our discussion. We actually planned that we have a lot to discuss, so we will not introduce all of you, but we have it here in paper. If you do not know the experts here, just look into your briefing papers and you will find their CVs. Well, this panel is about trade and geopolitics. And many questions were raised by Mrs. Wyand about supply chains, international infrastructure, and economic security. Let me start with you, Mr. Trier. We thought, or we said, trade policy has changed as a result of long-term developments, and today it needs to include geopolitical perspectives like issues of dependency from authoritarian regimes or the question of changes in the relationship between European economies and the economies of global South. How do you see these changes? What is your basic analysis? What do we need to do in our trade policy to live up to it? Actually, we agreed to give all the panelists 4 to 5 minutes for an introductory statement, and then we will have a Q&A. Thank you for the invitation. Actually, I can just say I can only subscribe to everything Mrs. Wyand has said. Well, this is not possible. This would end the conference right now. But there are also other opinions, and if other opinions are raised, then I will join the discussion again. I was born in 1969. There were 3.6 million people living on this planet. 3.6 billion, of course, sorry. So it was 3.6 billion. Let me correct it now. It's almost 8 billion. Well, so many people live on this planet, and not all of them below the poverty line, but still too many. This has also something to do with trade policy and the division of labor. You could say, Mr. Bütikofer, this also means consumption of a lot of resources. I would say that's correct. And this is why it's also correct that in trade policy we have stopped. If we think bigger, deep and comprehensive agreements or WTO activities, we also look at the issue of resource consumption. And you mentioned it, Mrs. Wyand. Resource competition is also a consumption of resources. We now pay attention to it. And this brings me to the issue of an equal footing and doing things together. Then it means that we take the other countries along when it comes to standards. And now it applies what Mrs. Weyand said. We must not give the impression of regulatory imperialism. Well, we have learned trade policy is not only related to economic relations, but you, Mr. Bütikofer, also mentioned other areas in addition to geopolitics, issues trade policy should tackle. I'm very happy about the question, how can trade policy better the world, that you have added something, because we can also ask too much. And when we come to geopolitics and say we criticize other regimes, then we need to be precise. We discussed it, and Mrs. Weyand, I always have to come back to you because you really mentioned the whole spectrum. In the case of Russia, it's very clear this is no longer de-risking, it's decoupling. That we, as the hopefully broad rest of the world, unfortunately there is not yet a agreement among all the countries, including potentially closer trade partners like India. This is a question we need to tackle, but when it comes to China, we must not make the mistake, when you know one, you know all of them. When you know Russia, you know China. And this is that we do the same with China. No, rather we have to look at our strategic dependencies. Where do we need to give life to the option of resilience? Where do we need perhaps subsidies, because importer countries do not pay so much attention to rules? And here I just mentioned the IRA. We have to be careful, and in order not to put off other countries like India, which reproach us, yeah, you want to cut off your market. And a last point, do things on an equal footing. Talking about Mercosur, I had an interesting discussion with the former negotiator of Brazil. They said, you talk about sustainability now. Just look at where we stand. You, the EU, already did regulatory imperialism, perhaps not so much, but with the deforestation regulation, with CBAM, with the German Supply Chain Act, you already set standards. This already means sanctioning in our eyes, so you do not take it further. So I would say, please talk to the others and take their opinion into consideration. But at the end, I just thought that you do not 100% are with Mrs. Weyand when it comes to Mercosur. My next question is to Mrs. Freimuth. Well, I'm interested in your fundamental position about the relationship trade and geopolitics, but let me use an example. Mrs. Weyand said we should tackle these questions with partners together. My impression is when it comes to CBAM, we worked with the partners before we decided, well, this is the direction to take. Is this a positive example? What are the lessons? Thank you. We at the European Investment Bank, the financial arm of the EU, have worked with partners for decades in developing joint projects and implementing them. So it's our bread and butter business to work together with partners. I think this is a very important point. We have seen repeatedly that our ideas, which are well intended, but we didn't have on our screen right from the beginning what are the priority interests and also problems our partners. I worked in Ike in Africa, and we experienced this when we took the Green Deal to Africa. Well intended, we want to push it ahead as partners, but I think we have to look carefully what are the problems our partners face to come to a win-win situation. And here we try to use lighthouse projects. Otherwise, we will get to a geopolitical discussion so that others that are also active in Africa, like the Chinese, act in a different way and are perhaps conceived in a positive way at a first glance, but they are not sustainable in the long run. So we Europeans have a lot to offer, but it's important that we develop together. CBAM, do you want to dwell a bit more on CBAM? No. No, I don't want to. Not yet. I see it as proof that's perhaps not such simple to coordinate with our partners. But Mrs. Rudloff, I do not ask questions. Probably you would just push the question aside, but just give your introductory statement.
Okay, wonderful. So I will ask the questions to myself. And let me take the perspective of economic sciences, because I think that is important for all of our discussions, and I would like to focus on 2 points. One side is the policy portfolio of the European Union facing the many challenges that were mentioned, and also then the aspect of partnerships and being a partner. So regarding the first point, from the First of all, you have to address the question of state and the market, and the question that many scientists ask and politicians ask, whether the current challenges are different now, calling for a different kind of state intervention by the state actors, a different manner of acting. And some people say that the geopolitical challenges could be seen as a so-called external effect. Why is that important? Because it means that the state can intervene with rules. So there can be decisions on supply from a certain region, maybe because they have low costs, and so many companies maybe act in this based on this basis, but this can lead to a dependency because all the businesses react in that way. This is something that we know very well in the field of the environment. We speak of external phenomena, and therefore the state can intervene. But the question is how the state can act. That there are different areas, different chapters in the field of security policies, more interconnection between domestic security, foreign security aspects. Then we have more focus on the internal market, no more arguments in favor of industrial policies. That is not a typical European policy, but we have many approaches, and also have to look at coherence here. And another aspect is crisis reaction. So this has become very strong since the corona pandemic started. We have to look at critical infrastructures, how they have to be maintained, and what is part of this, and who is responsible. We have the single market emergency instrument, and we have to ask questions about the security of supply here. So many different new challenges, and here we have to be coherent. Also scientists call for coherence, which is quite difficult to implement in certain circumstances, difficult decision-making structures, but the question needs to be asked about what kinds of regulatory state interventions do we have in financial terms and other terms, and also when the state becomes an actor in certain ways. I'm also an agrarian scientist, and if you look at the agriculture policies, there is a 70-year-old history of all that you can imagine in terms of state intervention, and also a long, many experiences, export subventions, stocking. So one has to look at the different options that are available, and also the exit strategy. So it should not always be continuous crisis, and hopefully, and therefore not a continuous state intervention. And my last point, partnerships. Looking for partnerships is very much at the forefront of the political debate. And of course, we often ask what are the good partners for us in terms of our security of supply, but what kind of partners are we for others? And that is also important, not just in the field of sustainability, but also security of supply. If we think of medical goods, we had to look at the EU market, and also we are important for the supply chains of other countries. So all that we import is also imported by other countries, and our focus on security, what is the effect on others? And now speaking about sustainability, here a bridging idea could be And it is what is important what you just said about the global south. Sometimes it is difficult how we are as a peer perceived. So trade agreements are per se with a partner. Of course, in most cases, the partners are the government levels, but also civil partners included. But the Commission also stated that we wanted to strengthen partnerships with bilateral roadmaps, and we have to define milestones. And that should also be introduced for the unilateral measures, also for the deforestation regulation. So, interestingly, in the field of trade agreements, there are partnerships, and this should also be used in other, also unilateral fields. And now you, Mike. Maybe the three major challenges for trade policy, I would say. The question, first of all, whether it contributes to tackling the climate crisis, and also, secondly, how we can shape the trade policy with regard to the competition with authoritarian regimes, for example, and the third place about the relation between the global north and the global south. Now, from the point of view of the parliamentary group in the Bundestag, how could you bring put these three challenges together? Let me start with the foundation that we work on. Katharina Dröger mentioned that we want to shape trade in a fair way, and the economy is for the wealth of the citizens and not the other way round. And trade policy needs to take this into account. Well, I also used to be an entrepreneur, and I know that, of course, profits are important, and that needs to be made available or possible through trade. But from a political point of view, there are other objectives that are overarching in addition to climate, also security policy and foreign policy are important, but we have to ask ourselves what we want to achieve. We want to achieve wealth and well-being for people, and how can we combine all this? Now in the trade agenda, we define some points. We want to look at the ILO standards, also the Paris Agreement, all that needs to be taken account in the trade agreement is important, and also the parliamentary group of the Green Party and the European Parliament also asked about anchoring these measures. That is important. Of course, we want to work on an equal footing, as has just been said here, but I think that one notion, neocolonialism, regulatory neocolonialism or imperialism, all these terms have been mentioned, but the contrary is true when you look at the populations interested by this. If you look at the indigenous people and the history of colonialism and where their living spaces have been reduced much in the past, but here we want to go in the other direction. We want to help the climate and the people on site, and now, of course, we have to find a joint common denominator. We therefore do not only discuss with other governments, but also with civil society in these countries, and also discussions are going on with other countries. On this, let me also say a few words on values. I think, Ms. Weyand, you mentioned the Liberal Club of Democracies. That would not be sufficient. Of course, we could we understand this, and the value-based trade policy is not one criterion, but is only among other criterion. Of course, our trade relations need to be intensified with those countries with whom we share values. But as has just been said, decoupling from China is not possible for practical reasons, and that means we also have to find compromises. And what is, of course, in the case of gas, we, for example, will also have to discuss with Qatar in terms of security of supply, and sometimes we have to look for alternatives, and values are a criterion, but it should not be seen as absolute values in all situations. Of course, we have to talk about diversification. We need to create alternatives. We do not should not become more too dependent from certain companies or certain countries, as we've seen with Russia. And you mentioned China. Here it is only to a certain percentage, but we need to look for alternatives. What was the third point? Third question, yes, the global South. How can we tackle the challenges here? The global gateway projects mirror this idea. International trade policy should not only focus on exchanging goods. When it comes to other countries that we're negotiating with who are not so highly developed, like in the case of Brazil, how can we help them to reach these standards? Well, also with technological cooperation, this can help to create infrastructure and to produce at higher technological levels. These are projects that can be implemented within the Global Gateway initiative. We are not doing neo-colonialism, but we want to improve the situations, and we also want to achieve transformation. And without a functioning world climate and without a functioning Amazon region, but there are also other important ecosystems, biodiversity in the world. We all need this as a basis for our lives and also for our economies. Thank you. I will also get back later on global gateways, but my next questions focuses on another point. We mentioned cooperation a lot. That's very positive, because for some time we only discussed about autonomy, and trade had to add the adjective open, at least. So we want to focus on cooperation, but how do we want to do this? We have different levels, plurilateral, multilateral, bilateral. Maybe I would like to ask you, where is cooperation possible? Do we need a regional free trade agreement between the EU and ASEAN? When we see that in the Asian region, how they organize trade areas, should we say that we want to participate in this, that we want to join them? And if we see that the US, for example, with their Chips for Alliance, if they work with South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan, should we say that we want to join them as a Chips 5 partners? So which levels of cooperation do we have to promote in order to implement and realize these goals that we mentioned? Well, with your question, in a way you're answering, providing an answer already. It is complex, actually, and the complexity can be seen and the fact that in our discussions, we do not ponder values sufficiently. We discuss trade politics in connection with geopolitical interests and asking ourselves how we can help to protect human rights through trade policies and a whole range of EFG criteria. So there are many different aspects that have to be taken into account when it comes to human rights protection. So we provide, we have economic preferences and go to certain markets, and then we expect the same from others. And the more plurilateral it becomes, the more difficult it gets. And then we have to, sometimes we find out that this aspect of security is more important than the economic aspects or well, so the ESG criterion often needs to be taken into account, and you can see this also when it comes to the federal government here in Germany with regard to the terrible actions of Russia. So they had to ponder what are the important values for us to follow, and when it is very complex here. For example, in the European Union trade policy, we handed over responsibility, for example, to Ms. Weyand. Well, you are mentioning too many different points. Yes, I'm a bit stepping back. But of course, we have to find agreements between 27 member states. Now, if we want to reduce complexity, and there are many approaches, and it's not just about choosing one approach, many different approaches are possible. Also at a WTO level, we can promote certain aspects, and maybe in some situations a common denominator can be found. ICEP, you mentioned here we have to take certain interests into account, but in terms of security interests, for example, maybe it's difficult to combine this with sustainability aspects. I have to see what is more important, and in each situation we have to decide what is important. And regarding bilateral agreements and the question with the global south, I think it is more promising when sustainability standards in the long run. We have also to see the future perspectives and actually have a perspective that takes also the future development into account, and then we can also use our economic strength and then allow a high level of preference to that partner compared to another partner.
Well, I have to interrupt you. We need to achieve a transatlantic relationship and a climate club. This is a great idea, but we should have done this before, earlier. When you ask such a question, you get such an answer. You always give me the answer you want me to give me, no matter what my question is. I'm aware of this, but I've noticed one thing. You spoke twice about compromise, and it was always related to ESG criteria. No other deep and comprehensive, how much market access. This wasn't mentioned. But, you know, I want to involve the other panelists. Mrs. Rudloff, what about the forums? Do we need new levels here? Or is it sufficient to use the instruments available? Climate Club sounds great. Nobody knows what it is. And after we have made CBAM, now we say everybody can join our climate club. You will like it. Perhaps not everybody will like it. What kind of forums do we need for such cooperation? It's a difficult question. Perhaps this is why we don't like to answer such questions. Well, it's easy to talk about new fora or to pronounce them, sometimes perhaps out of despair, or to create a new level to do an action. Perhaps looking at the options available, it's probably not necessary to have another forum yet. At the same time, it's quite difficult to answer what forum for what. Well, I mean, of course, one could always say WTO is the first best solution, but if it is not possible, what shall we do then? And many have done it to create bilateral agreements. Probably it's true that we have to make sure what goals we want. The Tinnenberg rule says one measure, one action for one goal. One can mention synergy effect. That may be a reason to have different actions for one goal or different goals for one action. When it comes to strategic open autonomy, we spoke about autonomy, about open, but only indirectly about strategy. But this is difficult to answer. Where are the trade-offs? What offers itself as a partnership? A partner you saw as like-minded, but who no longer is like-minded. I think there is no recipe, but there is one point I would like to mention. We talk how we see ourselves, the EU as a big sales market, so the sales strength, but I think we all notice shifts. Perhaps we are no longer the big sales market in the long run. And so instruments like, if you want to sell us your products, you have to comply with our rules. And this doesn't function perhaps so much. So sanctions are no long-term solution. You can respond in the short term, but you need to be part of common investments, and here different fora can play a role. Well, Mrs. Freimuth, well, Global Gateway, I know that the EIB, Mr. Dreyer, works for it. Countries from the African Union have just said they do no longer want to be just a commodity provider, but they want to start with value-added processing. Well, this sounds very promising for us because when it comes to important raw materials, we are very dependent on China. If we had processing capacities, it would give us a choice. Is it a necessary project for Global Gateway that we say we will fund the building up of processing capacities for strategic raw materials in a partnership project? I would answer with a very clear yes, and we in the EIB try to identify such projects. We see very interesting developments. We have first partnerships in the field of green hydrogen with Africa. And here both partners see it as a win-win situation. We see other interesting movements when it comes to rare earth minerals. So with the green transformation, we have a huge demand for batteries. And when I see in Zambia that they do no longer want to export their rare earth minerals to China, so why not produce batteries on the African continent? So this should be our target in Europe, to do it together. And here with the Global Gateway Initiative, we have a great tool to create positive examples which can be a role model in our neighboring continent. And we in our bank see a clear role to support lighthouse projects. Well, we have companies that would like to participate, but so far I've only heard lip service. It will come, it will come. I can promise you, well, there are de facto global gateway projects, new projects. There are some new approaches, Mr. Trier, but it's still early days. But you are right in one thing: we must not allow that Global Gateway becomes just a label to put on old policies. Mike, the change of an era in trade policy, does it need a guiding motto, not what is the opinion of the Greens? If the Germans want to find such a term, the Japanese found such a term with economic autonomy, do we need a different notion? It's a great question. We should have discussed it beforehand in the run-up. I do not have the super guiding buzzword here on the cuff of my hands. Well, guiding security is, of course, something we always said. We must not be dependent. In the past, it was Russia. Now it's China. And we have the same discussions we had about Russia. Now about China, it's diversification. Perhaps I can come back to your question. What formats are necessary? Modularization. We have learned these huge trade agreements take too long, and our approach with TTC and what we started with India is the right approach. Modularization, flexibilization could be one buzzword here. Just let's take India, where a comprehensive sustainability chapter is unrealistic, but at a more bilateral agreement, you can come to agreements that allow to raise standards in the partner countries. These are good terms. Well, we have time for 2 one-minute questions and 2 one-minute answers. Who wants to break the ice? Thank you. I'm Eutemeyer. I'm responsible for entrepreneurial due diligence. Well, things like the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, it's again against it because the basis of our LSAG are the human rights principles, are the OECD principles of 51 countries, also like Brazil. It's not protectionism, it's the implementation of international agreements. Well, you stuck to the time. Other questions? Good morning, Liz Kui from Greenpeace. I'm interested, we mentioned neo-colonialism. I'm of the opinion that such new regulations where the responsibility of companies is in the center should not be protectionism, but the new trade policy is based on the exploitation of the global south. It's a fact. Even the new orientation of the EU trade policy doesn't change this. It is colonialism. And my question, Brazil and Argentina said they want to renegotiate the Mercosur agreement because it doesn't take their needs into consideration. Isn't it neo-colonialism when the Commission says, no, we will not renegotiate it, we will have an additional tool which doesn't change the situation on the ground? This is my question. Now we have 1 minute response. The first one I would like to ask you, Mr. Trier, 1 minute. The two questions or statement and question go in a similar direction. I talk a lot to foreign partners about free trade and how to shape our economic relations. Mr. Reutemauer, we just worked in the German-Vietnamese Economic Commission, and there the Vietnamese representative said, how shall we implement your Supply Chain Due Diligence Act in our actions? And your questions about neo-colonialism, the answer is similar. The others say, we need your technology. Our companies invest worldwide, but they do not invest enough in the global south because the conditions there hardly make it possible. So we also have to discuss with them how can we arrive at conditions, and this will also brings us to sustainability criteria. Mrs. Rudloff, taking up what was just said, I do not use the term to use it again, neo-imperialism, when you relate it to the ability to implement things by both partners in a trade agreement or a supply chain regulation starting here, but down to the actors in the supply regions, it makes sense to look at the partnership to see how can the goal be achieved. If I'm serious about a goal, I want it to be implemented. So you have to look clearly what contribution can I make, what can the partner do, and I hear that it is very difficult, especially in Brazil and Argentina, to look what capabilities exist to have a road map also for these actions. And you know, the due diligence is part of the international law obligation of the state. But how can it be implemented? Just to say it's an international law obligation, I would say the implementation capability needs to be strengthened. And to say the EU trade policy is neo-colonialism, I find it difficult to answer. I'm not an historian, but contra-fact approach, you know, such an agreement serves to implement things, and both sides can negotiate something. The opposite would be autocracy, and this would be the worst option. Well, let me thank all of you for this very vivid, insightful discussion. Please give the panel a round of applause. They deserved it. Well, we reduced your coffee break by 3 minutes. So grab a cup of coffee or tea, and then we will go on with the second keynote or the second panel. Thank you.
Uns freut es sehr, dass Sie so rege Pausengespräche führen.
It's wonderful to have discussions also using the coffee break. But now I would like to ask you to end bilateral talks. And we're very happy to have our Secretary of State, Franziska Brandner, here from the Federal Ministry of Economics. And she will speak about the current situation and the current challenges for the federal government here in Germany. Franziska, please, the floor is yours. Thank you. I'm happy to be here on this conference of the parliamentary groups of the Bundestag and the European Parliament for the Greens. And that's very nice to see as a former member of the European Parliament. I think that the cooperation between parliaments is very important, and therefore, Anna, Reinhard, Katharina, I don't know if she's still here, and Mike. Thank you for organizing this event, ladies and gentlemen. I would also like to welcome the other colleagues from the Federal Ministry of Economics and Climate Action, and you played a very important role in developing this new trade policy. Thank you to the team and our ministry, and thank you for being here and for cooperating. Last Friday, we saw 1 year of invasion of Ukraine. The war is still ongoing, and looking at our peace order here in Europe, this has changed a lot, but it has also made a difference regarding the German so-called business model. Because with cheap energy from Russia, large sales market in China, cheap imports, and then our security also provided by the US that also had financial impacts. And I think we all understood that geopolitics has to be part of all the different areas, including economic policy and trade policy. For autocrats, political interests are always more important than economic interests. We heard that maybe Putin is also interested in selling the gas because otherwise he doesn't have this revenue. He is a rationally acting economic actor. But I think this kind of discussion was also addressed in panel 1 already, and we can therefore assume that in some situations political interests are considered higher than other aspects. And hello, Mr. Trier, great to see you. Great you're here. I'm really happy that we can discuss these trade topics here together. Now, climate challenges, our buzzword, and I think what also remains from our obligation towards the global south, it's important to help them in this transformation and to make it a joint shared transformation. And therefore the question is, what do we change and what do we improve? And of course we want to improve, and we want to put free and fair trade together. There are 3 main points that we have to consider here. First, the rail rule-based trade needs to be strengthened. The right of the stronger or the strength of law. That is the question, and we want to promote trade which is rule-based. Also, if it is sometimes difficult, it can be bilateral, multilateral, or plurilateral. Secondly, we want to work with partners at an equal footing with the green value chains, and we want to promote a fair world and want to diversify further in order to be able to reduce our dependency. You, Mr. Mavaya, mentioned the notion de-risking. That is an important buzzword, but of course we have to look at partners and build up something together. It's not about the fact that we need partners, but also that we want partners and that we want to promote something together with them. And that is an important difference maybe when we start our discussions with these countries, that we want to become our partners more and more. And also, I'm firmly convinced that we do not see deglobalization, but we want to open ourselves towards the world and more countries in the world. And maybe this is the real globalization in the sense of many partners and creating resilient green supply chains in the world. And new technologies and also the old technologies. This is our task, but it is also a challenge for us, and it is not trivial. And the third point is about climate action and trade, bringing these together. And I think this is highly important. The climate crisis can increase geopolitical risks and entail geopolitical risks, and for this reason we need to anchor sustainability in our trade rules. We try to save carbon emissions, and then we should not allow to unfair competition that can arise from these rules, and also we cannot allow deforestation of the Amazon rainforest and therefore increasing emissions. That would not make sense, and we want to promote, therefore, our trade policy in this sense. And we also think that we already made a few steps into the right direction. Let me say a few words on WTO, multilateral trade. Many people think WTO can be abandoned, but we are not in favor of this. We think that we need to further cooperate here. I met the head of the WTO 3 times recently in order to also show that even if these times are difficult, that we do not give up this multilateral organization. And I hope that all of you understand this, and I hope that the framework of the WTO is an important one for all of you. Last year we did very small steps, but at least we achieved some steps. Maybe we will also be able to achieve progress also this year, and but we should not give up. On the contrary, try to also convince our partners and to reform this organization together. As a European Union, we also initiated a lot of bilateral agreements with the WTO. I think we've been able to accelerate this, but there are limits also here. And the question is, what is in between? Does the possibility exist to achieve plurilateral agreements with a couple of countries that might then lead to a harmonization of standards and a liberalization of markets and to find a broader approach. And that way, that's important also in the terms of climate action. It's not about the climate club, but a climate forum, we call it now, and our rules should not create barriers, but they should prevent problems, and we want to achieve a race to the top. Therefore, create this, we'll work together in this forum, and also in the Inflation Reduction Act. In this context, we speak about the Raw Material Club. It's not just between the EU and the US, but also Japan, Canada, Indonesia, Chile, other countries that are interested, and to become partners here, and to create common standards and to access to markets. So this is a third option that is possible in the context of climate action, and that should be possible also in the field of raw materials. In the EU, the Raw Materials Act is imminent. So we should not just define our own criteria and then sometime later we have international rules. So we have to combine these rules and harmonize these. That rule-based WTO, EU, but also initiatives like the ones that I just mentioned. Regarding the second point on a partnership, diversification attempts and efforts, I think that, of course, our partners also want to achieve the added value also for themselves. This is something that you hear often, Mr. Try, but of course we cannot just build up everything in all the different countries. But of course, in some cases, we're also interested in having more added value in these countries when it comes to commodities. Sometimes the problem is processing, and this processing cannot always be done in Germany and or in the EU, and therefore we are certainly interested in having more diversification when it comes to processing in other countries, because we do not want to do everything in Germany and Europe, but we want to set up this partnership network. Now, more added value, more partnership in our trade agreements. How can we achieve this without promoting the things that do not make sense economically, and finding this balance, striking this balance in our trade agreements? That is important. We hear it from Brazil, from Indonesia, from India. All these countries express this wish, and we want to achieve this and added value is an important topic here, and it is important for the EU to elaborate concepts, and I think it's important to live up to these partnerships and to create more opportunities also for us in these countries. The last point that I would like to mention, of course, is the connection with the climate action and free trade. You all understood and said that it was a good timing that the TSD initiatives came from the EU, and we in our Traffic Light Coalition came up with the same proposals, and it is a positive coincidence, and this shows that in doubt trade support can also be withdrawn when climate objectives are not met by some countries. And in that case, that can also have repercussions on our trade relations. There is one example given by the current Mercosur negotiations. I'm quite confident that we will be able to achieve good results regarding the rainforest. Lula, of course, wants to protect the rainforest. It is an important objective for him, and also Marina da Silva, his minister for the environment, has a green policy, and for them it is important to protect the rainforest, and they understand that they do not do this for us, but they do it for themselves, and that they want us to support them, to help them, and in terms of sustainable use. And now we have to show that we are partners. This is our task now here, and of course, we have to write this down. It is about giving and taking. We have to show that we are serious about it, that it is not just an excuse, but that we really care with regard to the rainforest. And I hope that as a EU, we will be able to write down these mutual obligations and commitments, and I think the resolve of the Brazilian government is really important. I'm very confident that Robert Habeck, together with Özdemir, they will travel to Brazil and they will talk about agriculture. Agriculture plays a very important role here. We're also discussing with the Commission, because it will not be up to us to decide, but the Commission will take the lead, and the 27 member states have their say. But it is a window of opportunity to show that climate protection and trade can work together. It's important for both sides, and if we achieve this, I think it is a very important step. I think all those who work towards this aim also express criticism. That is also important, and we hope that we will achieve this. And I hope that also, of course, our businesses will play their role, and we also adapted our expert instruments to this end. There's, for example, export support that was more difficult for small and medium-sized enterprises, and but there was a request for so-called small tickets, smaller companies also to get this support from the state, but our ministry and we supported this, and now we have this achieved this guarantee, this new instrument that makes it possible for also for the small and medium-sized companies to open up to the world, because this is our joint objective. Thank you.
The speaker doesn't use the microphone. Unfortunately, the interpreters cannot translate her. The mic is working. I'm very pleased that we now have the second panel. The first panel discussed the geopolitical perspective. Here on the second panel, we will deal with green transformation and climate protection, again, in the context of trade policies. We are facing a climate crisis, and the German government and the EU Commission want to make us climate neutral. And the question was, how can all these goals of transforming our economy be implemented also externally? The Commission, also under green pressure, has set the stage, this so-called TSD review. Many autonomous instruments, and a lot has been launched, but today we want to take stock and to analyze where do we stand. Is it sufficient? What are interesting concepts? Or perhaps also to hear that we have taken it too far. I do not want to read out the CVs to save time. Let me start with Bettina Müller. She is a desk officer of Power Shift and the trade and investment expert. It is so important that the civil society exercised pressure. Bettina, many reforms were launched, but when you look at the trade agreements, do they have a positive climate effect, or do they contribute to more carbon? And how do you see the current forms? Are they sufficient, or do we have to take it further? Thank you, Anna. Thank you also for the invitation. Thank you for the very insightful debates we have had so far. Of course, we accompany the trade policy of the EU critically, and despite the many changes we welcome, we see the trade policy not as sustainable, also against the background of the planned Green Deal. It's about climate CO2 reduction, but also about other issues. Let me just point out a few that make this clear, that the EU trade policy is not yet sustainable and also not coherent. And we discussed the problem of a coherent trade policy with sustainability. Well, more trade leads to higher trade volumes, which increases CO2 and other emissions. This is not only due to more transport, but also products that are detrimental to climate, like cars. So in this way, we cannot make the EU climate neutral by 2050, but we also look at trade agreements like Mercosur. they lead to more trade with agricultural products, and this also has an impact on sustainable agriculture. Why is this the case? The trade volumes increase the price pressure on producers in the EU, in the Mercosur region. It leads to more deforestation despite the tools we already have with regard to monocultures, and also small farmers are expelled from the region. And there is also an increased focus on export crops, which also has an impact on climate change. And we are also concerned about growing dependencies on industrial countries in the global south, because sectors on the ground are weakened. And one example is the Mercosur agreement, in our opinion. And a last point, special complaint rights. We have not yet discussed investment protection in the Chile agreement. We still have these special complaint rights, and also in other agreements. We think such special complaint rights should not be allowed if our priority is to stop climate change. If we want to focus on human rights, such rights must be abolished. So, thinking at the different agreements, we do not want them to be signed because they do not meet the demands of the 21st century. In the second round, we can look more at the solutions you propose. Mrs. Weyand said that trade agreement also helps to spread climate technology, and CO2 emissions were also reduced by agreements. I think it's important to understand the facts. Thank you for this question. I looked how this reduction of trade emissions with Korea and the EU were calculated, so sustainability calculations, and then also ex post calculations. And the South Korea EU agreement did not lead to higher emissions, and worldwide it seems to have reduced emissions because trade was diverted, but the amounts are really minimal. There is an ex post evaluation with Colombia, and there again, for Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador, because of the products traded, and there are different categories, the CO2 emissions went up, but because of the reduction effects, they reduced globally, but this is 0.02% of what we need to reduce. So I think it's not correct to call it a real reduction. So your analysis is that products detrimental to the climate are traded more. Well, let now Andreas Outridge, Deputy Chair of the Parliamentary Group Alliance 90, the Greens. Andreas, perhaps you can give us the opinion of the parliamentary group. Why did you exercise such a lot of pressure to strengthen sustainability chapters? What are your plans? Well, let me start exactly here. It is a description of many different realities, of different trade relations from the past and the present. So if you want to look at trade policy and change it, you have to look at possibilities, how to do it. One solution would say we do not want to have more international trade. We do not want to differentiate between good and poor agreements, and to say trade itself is the problem and we want to terminate it or reduce it as much as possible. This would be one option, but the other option, the one we choose, is to say we have another question. We see all the different dependencies from dictatorships. We see poor trade relations, problem in supply chains, and we need to devise a path that leads us to a trade policy where we get human rights standards, environmental standards. This will not be done overnight, but in the negotiations within our group, we started from these premises. It was not always easy. Franziska Brandner and myself spent hours to push it ahead. And one point, as mentioned by Franziska Brandner, was that the TSD review at the EU level is to be pushed ahead, but we Germans didn't have a German position how to push it. One point for us was only if this becomes a fact, and you know, Germany has a big voice at the EU level. We said only if we integrate this, we can support this trade policy. This is not meant to ignore that there are thousands of problems which need to be solved. But I think this is the point, and we see that Alena Baerbock traveling around the world to bring 141 countries together in one position. So to interrupt this is not an option. We want to make it better. It was very helpful that you told us something about the negotiations in the coalition. Now, Mr. Ackermann, head of Foreign Trade Department. Good to have you here, Mr. Ackermann. From an entrepreneurial perspective, how important are these trade agreements? Well, with China, one of our biggest partners, there is no such an agreement. And what is most important, tariff reduction or perhaps property rights? We have discussed before that trade agreements became bigger and bigger, but then also the question, how can this transformation be included in our trade? Thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to start from some background information. Why is trade important for us as in the field of machine engineering? Machine engineering is a mid-sized sector. This is very important. The average company has about 150 employees. These companies are mid-sized, but also very international. 80% of what is produced here is exported, 55% in the rest of the world. 1 million people work in this sector. And these are more than 600,000 people working in the field of export that create wealth and taxes. This is the starting situation. What do these information need? Stable framework conditions. This was provided by the WTO over decades. Most WTO procedures affected China and the US, and these countries complied with these sentences, but this does not work anymore. There is the danger that the right of the strongest also affects trade. So the export of machines, how much is it threatened by protectionism? 80% are affected. These are increasingly subsidies also in the field of machine engineering. And of course, this distorts exports and it makes competition unfair. This is the starting situation. Our solution is it takes free trade agreements that regulates all these issues and provide stable framework conditions. Europe has already done quite a lot. 74 agreements have been concluded, but there are some major gaps. You mentioned China. We will probably never get an agreement with China. Then there are the US. The TTIP negotiations failed, and we have nothing at the moment. But there are other countries like India which are willing, but perhaps not as willing as we want them to be. When we use our high standards, I do not think these countries are prepared to fulfill them right from the beginning. We need some flexibility in trade agreements so that we show options how these countries can embark on these paths together with us. This is a bit how we see it as a mid-sized company.
One more question, if I may. The current existing trade agreements, are they, from your perspective, are they okay in terms of market access, but also transformation that you mentioned? Or tell me about India. If you want to export to this country, what are the major problems? There's no free trade agreement. For India, it's actually tariffs. I'm only referring to mechanical engineering. Mechanical engineering has 20% of tariff. tariffs, and then inside India there are also other problems for imports. So machines that are imported to India cost 30 to 40% more compared to Indian mechanical industry. India is one of the growth markets worldwide, and in the current free trade agreements or mechanical engineering at the end without tariffs in order to get to these free trade rules, you also have to consider the rules of origin. So these were helpful. But now, in the case of India, it was the first time that India insisted that they wanted to exclude certain parts from the tariffs regulations. So we did not understand why they choose a certain group of products, but in the end, the free trade agreements created a real free trade after a certain transition period, like 15 years, which is sufficient to prepare for this. Now, the sustainability is a new aspect in this context. In the field of mechanical engineering, it is not so difficult because we offer all the technologies that are required for sustainability, for energy production. We have the whole range. Every new generation of machinery saves energy, and also with digitalization, we help to create networks for factories. So we have the technologies for the energy transition, but the question is whether these countries are ready to buy these technologies. Of course, they cost more than technologies that are, let's say, less sustainable. And this is the discussion that we need to have. How can we induce our partners, convince our partners that they buy what is needed? And now, last but not least, Michael Kellner, our State Secretary, and also responsible for SME policies. You certainly talk a lot to entrepreneurs in this field. And what is the feedback that you get mostly when you discuss about the current challenges of globalization and this transformation? What is the role of this in the foreign trade relations? Yes, thank you. On the one hand, I see a great focus on the question of energy prices, competitiveness, and also the importance of international trade for large parts of SMEs, SME sector. And at the same time, there's also an incredible debate which is growing regarding our approach to China. There's a broad discussion in the political sphere and also more broadly in the German business sector. We've seen these debates also in the past, but now with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, we see this more clearly. We want to reduce risks and dependency. It's often said that also a dependency from China needs to be reduced, but it is a broad debate. It's not just one and the same opinion everywhere, and I think it is a positive to have this debate. I was always this morning at the conference of the Employers Association of the German industry, and I think it's actually true that there is a very broad debate. It's not just at the level of think tanks. And I would also like to say that if we look at what happened last year, and not just in the field of energy policy and skilled labor. I think we have managed to remain one actor at the EU level, and that is a great success. We can see that the European Union has a strength and also is able to work together with partners when it comes to setting standards. And we want sustainability aspects, also biodiversity, protection of human rights. All these need to be anchored in the trade agreements. And what Franziska said is correct. We will not abandon or leave the WTO. We want the agreements at this level because it is important, also in terms of greening trade. 2 more points which are linked. I think we need a partnership on an equal footing, and that means for the benefit of both sides. I think all the figures and analysis that I can see that we need for a transformation, what we need in terms of commodities. Of course, we will also need primary raw materials also in the future. And therefore, it must be our objective to produce these with high ecological and social standards. And it is very clear, and this is also why I mentioned China, we need a diversification here. And that is one point. And the second point, which is linked to this, we have to acknowledge this. Of course, we still will need primary raw materials and raw materials that we get from the we need to keep them in a circular economy. We use this term here, and it is an important point, and it needs to be part of our industry policy. And it's not just about and waste disposal, but it is important to use these products again and again, and this should become part of a strategy if we look at how we want to deal with raw materials. Yes, we will also talk about this topic in the second round. Of course, we will also take questions from the audience, but let me ask one more question to Bettina. You said from your perspective, Mexico and Chile would not sign the agreement, but from your point of view, from the point of view of power shift, what would be an agreement that you could sign? We mentioned the TSD chapter and other instruments, but still there's other work to do. So how can this transformation become part of the trade agreements, and what are your approaches to address the problems that you just mentioned? Yes, thank you for this question. We think that a completely new mandate is required for negotiating trade agreements. We are not against trade agreements, but we need to better trade and better for whom we have to ask, and therefore what does better mean? And here we are quite convinced that a new mandate is required, and it's not sufficient to have sustainability chapters. Of course, that is great, but wouldn't it be better to react to this ex ante? So that means beforehand, considering that there can be a lot of production of CO2 already in the production, that many productions are linked to human rights violations, and these should be maybe excluded before, and we should not wait for a violation of human rights before we act. Then based on a sanctions-based sustainability chapter that is a contradiction. So we think that trade agreements from the very beginning, from the very start, should see to it that problematic products are not traded. Maybe so if there are maybe action plans or roadmaps with certain sustainability goals, and if certain improvements can be reached, then maybe you can discuss again. But in those cases where products that are detrimental to the climate, here one should react beforehand. Of course, we need raw materials, but here we talk about climate partnerships, but who are the partners? So we have our partners, and others have other partners, and but many partners are not amused when it comes to the plans of the European Union. And there are some civil society organizations are against those attempts to use and produce raw materials and at the same time destroying certain damaging certain areas. So often the reduction or growth without economic growth is maybe an important slogan. Is economic growth actually the best benchmark? And shouldn't we talk about reduction much more? Maybe we need raw materials for an energy transition, but do we need them to produce SUVs, for example? So we have to ask ourselves for what these raw materials are needed and used. And in some areas, there should also be reduction. There are areas where trade is important. I mentioned agriculture. And we need certain exceptions. Okay, let me ask you here. So if you consider offensive interests and defensive interests, because some countries have the offensive interest, active interest to export agricultural products, and other countries are interested in importing this. So if there is no agricultural trade, how can you take up this? Of course, this is also about interests, you are right, but our partners, of course, are interested in an exchange of green technologies. What you just mentioned, German, European producers are maybe forerunners, and there can be interest in an exchange of these. If we say we want your lithium, and we have then machines that produce very good machinery, so that you can produce this under positive, very good social, environmental conditions. So that means we have a technological transfer, and you buy our products, but then we get access to your raw materials. But at the same time, you are able to set up this value-added chain. So therefore, processing takes place in these countries, and also the knowledge transfer. Knowledge is transferred to these countries. So. Great knowledge. Andreas seems to agree. Can you pick up what has just been said? Do you think that this completely unrealistic, or do you think that there are ways to implement this and to introduce this to the agenda? Yes, I took a note here, and let me just make a few comments. The first point is about reduction, and it is a fundamental question, of course. I think, actually, and it's also what Michael Kellner just mentioned, the question about a circular economy. And the circular economy would then lead to a reduction of consumption of certain goods. That is clear. If we reuse the lithium in different contexts, so there are recycling sites. I visited these in the last few weeks, and this makes it possible to reduce actually the consumption of certain raw materials, and this is a discussion that needs to be brought forward. So it's not about reducing international cooperation. That is really important. Diversification is also important, but we cannot continue in that way, and where we extract more and more and just damaging the world more. And of course, we need the circular economy. And this other question is for whom? So for whom are these things that result from this kind of commodity? And what we can offer also in this international concert of different actors, we, China, European Union, is exactly this. We want to take part in an exchange that brings a benefit for both, for all. Therefore, having a debate where we discuss about trade agreements where the countries that are interested in trading with us and where these countries want to get into trade agreements with us because they want this for their future development. Some people say it's, well, I have the simplest solution, but in the case where a solution is not sustainable and where this certain solution does not contribute to a positive development in the countries, then it's maybe not the right way. And a third point, you mentioned specific products as a question. Well, I think what one needs to do, because of course we have to look at all the different trade relations. We have to say that standards need to be met, and sustainability also. But when we think of certain products and where we want to maybe simplify trade for certain products, you mentioned WTO, climate goods, and we thought about this for a long time, and we discussed this aspect of trade relations with the US, whether one could focus more on climate goods. It's also linked to the WTO. It's not a simple question. There will not be a TTIP 2.0. That will probably not be the case, and following the debate in the Congress. But the question will be whether one could focus on certain products or even a simpler certain standards, to simplify certain standards for certain products in order to simplify the trade with these products in climate technology products in order to achieve a high level of climate protection, and so the development that's important for Latin America. And the last point, Mercosur, Franziska Brandner mentioned this point. I think it's a highly interesting question here, because on the one hand, you have the partners in Brazil, and Lula de Silva says, of course, they want to protect the rainforest, but they open up a second question, and I think this summarizes our discussion very well. The idea that here we have development, we destroyed the climate, and now we tell them they have to protect the rainforest. And of course, this is not an appropriate attitude, and therefore it is now our task in these relations to answer the question how we can achieve an agreement that makes the development possible in that country, and how they can increase the readiness to protect the rainforest there.
Thank you, Andreas. You already gave a comprehensive response, and we're short of time. But one short question. The coalition wanted to give up the Energy Charter Act, and we in the European Parliament also made this the position of the European Greens. Investment protection agreements which we had so far pose a major climate protection risk. So we do not want them for the future and give up the existing ones. So we started on this principle. It was not easy, but we said at the end Germany will give up the Energy Charter. Well, I hope this will have a cascade effect. I hope it will destroy itself and will disappear. But one thing is important. I also talk to many companies, and there's also a corporate representative here. The point is not to have no protection for investments. What we saw in the old agreements was that issues of indirect expropriation, etc., led to a situation where no climate protection could be implemented without major claims for damages. Just the example of Vattenfall. When, of course, we do not want to have expropriation and national treatment. We are for investment protection, but not for things that prevent climate protection. This was very important. Mr. Ackermann, you mentioned worldwide subsidies. In Brussels and in Berlin, we discuss the IRA and what should be the European response. This is the issue today. We want to push ahead with transformation, but there are also global economic relations. What would be a good response? Are you satisfied what the Commission presented last week? Well, IRA, this is not trade policy. There are two approaches. The Europeans use the Green Deal prohibitions, while the US uses incentives. We in the machine engineering think that IRA will bring benefits. We will benefit. We see a massively increasing US business, and there are many recovery programs that led to a demand for machines. And since US machine engineering is not up to standard, they need machines from import. But what IRA says is not trivial. We just analyzed it and showed that it is very complicated. How shall a foreign company get trainees at the construction sites that are trained according to their standards? What our colleagues see, especially in the field of hydrogen and solar energy, they are afraid that investments will leave Europe and go to the US. And when it comes to hydrogen, we need some reasonable reference units. And our colleagues see the danger that they will not be made here, but in the US. So there are also some negative effects, but the main problem we have in Europe is over-regulation. Regulation is so complex that it is difficult for companies to benefit from the funds available in a way they need to benefit to increase things. The IPSIS are so complex. I do not know how many use it, but for the SMEs, it is very difficult. We do not need new rules, more subsidies. No. Last point, wind energy. It's not possible that wind energy doesn't play a role because we are not able to implement things. Baden-Württemberg cannot be our goal, but if this continues like this, industries will go abroad. So we need to reduce complexity. I think Michael Kellner now really wants to respond. Do we have too much regulation here? And perhaps you can also say something about lithium, circular economy. Should this also be a part of our trade agreements? And if so, how? So I'm juggling many balls here. Too much regulation, well, sometimes you also despair as a politician, but often different rules come together from the local, regional and national level. Some rules come from standardization committees of German industries, which need to be suspended in a legal way. We live at a time where we need to show responsibility and make fast decisions. We showed this when it came to energy security, and also the European Commission last year in December made a number of decisions that lead to faster planning decisions. Decisions need to be taken at all levels, also at the lower levels, to give permits. And sometimes we are really just too slow. I see the challenges from the IRA, but as an ecologist, I'm happy about the efforts in the US to decarbonize. And I also see it as a wake-up call when it comes to permits. I mean, it's sometimes really very, very long, and it may lead to gray hair. We all feel the time pressure to achieve the Paris climate goals. So this is a point when we need to become faster. It's a kind of wake-up call, and a lot is going on, though perhaps not quickly enough. The direction has to be right. The Energy Charter is an example. Part of our policy must be to quicker give up our dependency from fossil fuels. Last year, diversification, we had to do many things. I mean, of course, more coal, but we do not want to use state funds for such things. Of course, we could discuss individual products. The economic delegation in Malaysia, palm oil was there a major issue. Of course, we do not want to have it in biofuel, and subsidies were stopped there. That's correct. On the other hand, it also applies to foodstuff where there is a need, and this also applies to lithium. When it is produced, you do not know whether it's used for an SUV or a small car or an electric locomotive. But to weigh and say it can only be for this or that purpose, actually the point is to press for sustainability criteria in those agreements. We have time for 2 short questions. So again, 1 minute for the question and for the response. Please wait for the mic. Thank you. Now I've got 2. I'm Flavia from the office of Sabine Grützmacher. I've got a question about the supply chain directive. I have a friend working at Salzgitter AG. He bought magnesium from China and had to write a report about human rights protection about magnesium mines in China. And, well, I was a bit disappointed. Will it become better with the new directive so that it is not just some interns who look for some information on the web? Well, if somebody else wants to take the floor, but I've already spoken. If it's okay for you. Lukas Probst, looking at the rainforest, the tipping point, climate conservationists cannot clearly say when it will be achieved. Wouldn't it make sense, looking at raw materials, saying we have a budget for raw materials for different sectors and to do a study and to include the figures you achieve in the trade agreements? So to anchor the budget, perhaps, Michael, you can answer the last question. As a moderator, I'm not allowed to comment, but Bettina or Andreas can say something about the supply chain. So everybody of you has 1 minute. I can answer it. The directive, this, as far as I know, it is still in a negotiation process, and I cannot exactly tell you how it will be implemented. What we see that we have a supply chain act in Germany that makes very concrete provisions, but the deeper you get into the supply chain, you take on responsibility if human rights and other standards are not complied with. It makes sense to have this in a European way because our goal is to get a level playing field, and Anna will implement it. I try to be very brief. One more point, because here I get a lot of criticism from the businesses. I have a long history with the Tasreen factory. We started about 10 years ago to talk about responsibility in us. And Carica, a small SME, really checked it. And they said, we want to be more resilient, to have more know-how. We look in our supply chain. The big companies slowly joined, even including KIK. This we need to achieve if we want to be sustainable. We need know-how about the supply chains. And Mr. Ackermann, I've just got 1 minute. We are not against the Supply Chain Act, and I'm not sure about you get the fundamental criticism, but our point is how is it implemented? And we are in favor if it can be controlled. We can control it in our company, in our supply chain, and in our subsidiaries. And what I find disturbing that the only examples come from textile industry, as if industry just encompasses textile company. None of our company has an interest that human rights are violated in their supply chain. I went to India where we say we can't buy anything, and I think self-respecting businessmen does it. There are some black sheep, and they are used to punish the rest. If we had time, I would respond. But shall I say something about the Supply Chain Act? Just 1 point. A major mistake was to say it will not affect SMEs, and everybody knew it was wrong. And I think this dishonesty comes back to us. You just said, and I believe you, you are interested in complying with human rights. So this would be and deserves a special debate as to demand planning. So I think it's nice to think to find out what a raw material is for, but when you just look at very simple raw materials, I mean, there are many different possibilities. Talking about lithium, nobody will know what the battery technology will be in 10 years. So I believe I like the idea of doing demand planning, but I just think it cannot be realized. Thank you. And now at the end, not answering the question, I would like to be a bit polemic. The energy charter treaty was mentioned, and unfortunately the German government also decided to ratify CETA, and there the same procedure exists. And both EU Mexico and EU Chile use these mechanisms. I think it's a lot of eyewash, and there is quite a lot to make up. And Germany is one of the world champions of ISCS, and we should always include environmental and human rights standards. So yes, many old bilateral agreements of previous governments still exist, and we have to deal with them. First, thank you very much to all the panelists, but now we also have Chantal Kopf, member of parliament, and she will just summarize the lessons learned and the next steps. But first, I would like to thank all the panelists. Thank you very much. I will be brief. You all are waiting for lunch, and it's difficult to add something. A lot has been said. There are many smart brains dealing with trade policy at different levels. We need these clever ideas, but I don't think that there is somebody with the perfect answer, and this is probably also not possible. But it's important to find solutions to shape active trade policies. Just a few ideas. We talked about values, how to align trade policy with values. And given countries like China that do not change our values, and when we call them system rivals, then I think the borders between value-oriented policy is very important, and others have other ideas about human rights, climate protection, and but also for us, raw materials are of central importance. And of course, we want to conclude good trade agreements focusing on all these standards because without a global rainforest, the situation will become unbearable, not only for us, but especially for the people on ground. We question neo-colonialism. We need to continue this debate. We said our ideas serve the people in the global south, their freedoms and rights. At the other hand, the EU negotiates with the governments, and the governments decide how the countries position itself in the world. So we will see that the upcoming agreements will be more complex when it comes to sustainability than CETA and New Zealand, but it is worthwhile to achieve such agreements, especially in the Asian regions. Partners are waiting for us, and of course all this needs to happen at an equal footing. I think it's also very important that we look at the specific agreements. What need the partner countries to get from us? How can these agreements be streamlined? How do we coordinate our trade goals with other goals and standards? And what is also very important for our future work, it requires funds. We need funds to protect the rainforest. So this is very important, for instance, for Brazil, and also development cooperation plays a role. So it's not enough to have more funds for the German army, but also for environmental protection. So this needs funding instruments at the European and German level. I'm also quite grateful that we do not sweep the issue of the WTO under the carpet, because the point is to make trade, to green trade. So this is a level we must not lose sight of. A lot has been said, and I'm looking forward to continue this debate with our colleagues in the European Parliament and in other bodies, and together with the experts we have heard today. Thank you very much.